Okay, well, welcome back to our study in the Old Testament as we continue our study in First Chronicles, and this morning we'll be in First Chronicles chapter 9. First Chronicles chapter 9. But before we look at this chapter verse by verse, let's open in a word of prayer. Father, we do thank you for this day that you give us all to be here, to come to study these great truths, to be able to gather and sing and praise you and to share our prayer requests and praises. What a blessed time this is. So we just pray you'd help us to focus on your word, that we would learn these truths that you've recorded thousands of years ago and that you've preserved from generation to generation, so that we can learn more about you and your plan, and ultimately that we would be vessels to bring you glory. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. So again, we are in First Chronicles chapter 9, and we finally come to the point of finishing up the genealogies of First Chronicles. So as I said during our intro this morning, everyone that was here, I think, should get some kind of certificate of completion. But if you don't get one from us, I think the Lord will bless you at the Bema seat. And it'll probably be a very small group. They're like, who have been through the genealogies of the Chronicles? And there'll be a very small group, and you guys will be there. Now, I say this is finishing up the genealogies, but chapter 9 is actually a little bit different in regards to the genealogical records that we've seen in chapters 1 through 8. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But let's look at an overall bird's eye view of this chapter, as we usually do. Verse 1, I believe, is possibly not necessarily part of chapter 9, but could ultimately go back to chapter 8. But it does serve as a bridge, I believe. So I think in either chapter it's appropriate. But I see it as a conclusion to chapters 1 through 8. And a conclusion that leads us into chapter 9, which we have the introduction, I think, in verse number 2. And then from there, we have the genealogical records that the chronicler decided to put in this chapter. Now, what's going to be a little different than what we have seen is that this section from verse 3 all the way through 34 is going to give us the genealogical records of the inhabitants of Jerusalem at the time the chronicler was writing, or just after the exile. So the previous chapters, genealogies, have been focused on the history and the connection of this generation to the past generations. But this chapter seems to focus in on the people who have come back from the Babylonian exile and have made their home in the city of Jerusalem. And this was an important part of Nehemiah's day. So a lot of these records that we see here in chapter 9, you can go back to Nehemiah chapter 11 and look at that chapter as a cross-reference. There's going to be some differences. There's going to be some things that are left out. There's going to be some other things that are included here in 1 Chronicles chapter 9. So you can check out Nehemiah chapter 11 after our service today. Let me back up to our, going way too fast here. Let me back up to our outline. So the vast majority of chapter 9 is going to focus on the city of Jerusalem and its inhabitants. But there is a second section of this chapter. And it's a small section at the very end from verses 35 to 44. And we're going to look at the line of Saul. And this, once again, is a genealogical record of the tribe of Benjamin. And why is that going to be there? Well, we'll get to that point. Because actually we covered it last week in chapter 8. So why do we see it again? So that's just a bird's eye view of where we're going with 1 Chronicles chapter 9 here. So again, a lot of this information is in Nehemiah chapter 11, so check that out later on. But let's look at verse 1 of 1 Chronicles chapter 9. And again, this is the verse that I believe is a conclusion, not just to chapter 8, but chapters 1 through 8. And the chronicler writes, "So all Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness." So we see here the chronicler mention, so all Israel. And I made that point a couple weeks ago when we discussed the focus on Judah and the Levites earlier in the genealogies. That was a big point the chronicler was trying to make, that the nation of Israel is founded upon a king and on religious worship. So he emphasized the tribe of Judah. He emphasized the tribe of Levi. But he was also making a point as he also included the other tribes in the genealogies, Asher and Manasseh and Ephraim and those other tribes, because he was making the second point that all of Israel has a purpose and a plan in God's outworking of history. So this term, all Israel, I think is very important because the chronicler is writing after the Babylonian exile. The 10 tribes that have gone to exile to Assyria are still in existence. They're still part of God's plan. Judah and Benjamin, who were exiled to the Babylonians in 586 BC, God has a plan for them as well. So God doesn't have just a plan for the northern kingdom or just a plan for the southern kingdom. He has a plan for all of Israel. So the chronicler emphasizes it here in verse 1, and I think that emphasis is going to continue as we work through the historical sections starting next week. So all Israel is enrolled by genealogies. And you know what that means, because we've been through every chapter and every verse and every word and every name. And if you missed out, go back to YouTube. I think we have most of those on there. So we know what the genealogies are. But he also gives us a little bit of other information. And behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel. Now, this is not what we consider 1st and 2nd Kings, or Kings in the Hebrew Bible. This is probably a separate genealogical record that was kept by the scribes who were appointed to serve the kings. It would be documents that we do not have in existence today. But notice that last point, and Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness. Now we saw back in chapter 5 a similar note about the northern kingdom, about those 10 tribes, that they were carried away not to Babylon, but to Assyria. So keep this point in the back of your mind, that Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness. We're going to come back to that point. Look at verse 2. And this is what I would say is the introduction now to the genealogy of chapter 9. Now the first who lived in their possessions, in their cities, were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. So the chronicler introduces us to this historical note that after Judah has been exiled, they come back. And it says Israel here. Now it doesn't say Judah, it says Israel. So once again, emphasizing the unity of the nation. They come back. But in addition to them, priests come back, Levites come back, and temple servants come back. Now I think that somewhat gives us part of our outline here, because we're going to focus on some Israelites, we're going to focus on some priests, some Levites, and then basically, it doesn't say temple servants, that's a different word, but the rest of the chapter, or rest of the section, is going to focus on gatekeepers, plus some other activities that are required for temple service. So I think verse 2 kind of sets us up for the content of chapter 9. So let's look, verse 3. Some of the sons of Judah, of the sons of Benjamin, and of the sons of Ephraim, and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. So now we're introduced to this very important point. Now we're going to focus in on not all of Israel as far as the land is concerned. We're going to focus on the Israelites as a people. But our focus on the land is going to be central to the city of Jerusalem, because it plays a major role. It played a major role in Israel's history, and it will continue to play a major role in Israel's history. Because we know that's where what is? The throne. And we also know that's where the temple is. Those two key facts that the chronicler is trying to put forward: the Davidic line and the sacrificial system that's required for Israel to operate as a nation. So Jerusalem becomes a major focus here. Now it's interesting going to Nehemiah chapter 11. There's a couple verses that start that chapter out. And it says, "Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 tenths remained in the other cities. And the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem." So as the exiles come back from Babylon, there was a purposeful repopulating of the city of Jerusalem. We know the leadership is staged there, but they also cast lots to fill the city because it is such an important part of the nation. So this is essentially what we see here. We see the outworking of Nehemiah chapter 11. So let's look at some specifics. And the first thing we're going to do, starting in verses 4 through 6, is to look at some of those from the tribe of Judah who come to Jerusalem. And it says, Uttai, the son of Ammihud, the son of Omri, the son of Imri, the son of Bani, the sons of Perez, the son of Judah. So this first mini section focuses on the descendants of Judah, and specifically from one of his sons, Perez. And then a second son is focused in on verse 5. From the Shilonites, and this is probably a derivative from his son Shelah. From the Shilonites were Asaiah, the firstborn, and his sons. From the sons of Zerah, and Zerah would have been another child of Judah, another son of Judah. From the sons of Zerah were Jeuel and their relatives, 690 of them. So we see the Judaites come back to inhabit the city of Jerusalem. And then we see a focus on Benjamin. Verse 7 through 9. From the sons of Benjamin were Salu, the son of Meshullam, the son of Hodaviah, the son of Hasanua, and Ibniah. That's an I, not an L. Eyes are starting to go a little bit here. The son of Ibniah, the son of Jehoram, and Elah, the son of Uzi, the son of Mikri, and Meshullam, and the son of Shephatiah, the son of Reuel, the son of Ibnijah, and their relatives according to their generations, 956. All these were the heads of their fathers' households according to their fathers' houses. So we get some information that not only Judah is repopulating Jerusalem, but the Benjamites. Now, the chronicler doesn't go past there. I think the assumption is other Israelites moved into the area, as we see per the introduction in verse 2 and 3. Obviously, Ephraimites came back, Manassites came back, but the chronicler here only focuses on Judah and Benjamin. And then he shifts his attention to the priests. Obviously, with the temple there, we need a repopulation of the priests. So verse 10 through 13 focuses on the priests. From the priests were Jedediah, Jehoiarib, Jachin, verse 11, and Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, the son of Meshullam, the son of Zadok, the son of Merioth, the son of Aktuv, the chief officer of the house of God. So we'll pause right there. So we see several priests inhabiting the city of Jerusalem. Jedediah, Jehoiarib, Jachin, Azariah, and then we'll get a couple more in verse 12. And Edidiah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Pashur, the son of Melchijah, and Maasai, the son of Adiel, the son of Jazerah, the son of Meshullam, the son of Meshilemith, the son of Emer, and their relatives, heads of their fathers' households, 1,760, very able men for the work of the service of the house of God. So we have the city of Jerusalem being repopulated by these priests. And notice there in verse 11, we have the son of Zadok, the son of Merioth, the son of Aktuv, the chief officer of the house of God. Probably a reference to the high priesthood. So not only the priest coming back to it, the idea of a high priesthood is also there in the city. But in addition to the priests, you need Levites. Because remember, priests had one responsibility. The Levites had other responsibility. So we focus on verses 14 through 16 on the Levites in a general way. Of the Levites were Shemaiah, the son of Hashub, the son of Azrikam, the son of Hashabiah, of the sons of Merari. And Bakkar, Haresh, and Galal, and Mattaniah, the son of Makkah, the son of Zikri, the son of Asaph. Now it's likely these, in addition to being Levites, are singers as well. Verse 16, and Obadiah, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Gaal, the son of Jeduthun, and Berechiah, the son of Asa, the son of Elkanah, who lived in the villages of the Nephathites. So now we see the Levites have also come into the city of Jerusalem. And some of them are specified here. Shemaiah in verse 14, Bakkar, Haresh, Galal, and Mattaniah in verse 15, Obadiah and Berechiah in verse 16. So they were probably leaders within the Levites, and other descendants came after them. Now, that last note, who lived in the villages of the Netophathites, this would be people who lived in the city of Netophath. And Netophath was very close to Jerusalem. So this is an old map, so we don't have the term Jerusalem, but the blue arrow is pointing to Jebus, which would later become Jerusalem. But Netophath was down here. And see, just above it is, again, maybe kind of hard to see, but is the town of Bethlehem. So Netophath was about 3 miles southeast of Bethlehem, so very close to the city of Jerusalem. And a lot of these cities played a major role because they would house Levites who would come into the city to perform their temple duties. We'll see that in just a minute. Now, the next big section we're going to get into is a focus on the gatekeepers. These were Levites who had a specific job of tending the gates. And it's interesting that most of this chapter is focused on them, assuming that the chronicler is highlighting their importance. So we see here in verse 17, now the gatekeepers were Shallum, Nakuv, and Talmon, and Ahiman. And they seem to be kind of the 4 chief gatekeepers. Most likely because there's 4 sides to a square, so each of them would have authority and jurisdiction over one side. And then the last part says Shallum, the chief. So out of these 4, there was a central leader, Shallum. And verse 18 says, being stationed until now at the king's gate to the east. And this was a very important gate. This was the gate that the kings would come through, why it was known as the King's Gate. And many people believe that it actually faced the sanctuary. So this was a very essential role in post-exilic Israel, and it's given to the leader of the gatekeepers, Shallum. So verse 18 continues, these were the gatekeepers for the camp of the sons of Levi. Verse 19, Shallum, the son of Kor, the son of Ebiasaph, the son of Korah, and his relatives of his father's house, the Korahites, were over the work of the service, keepers of the thresholds of the tent. And their fathers had been over the camp of the Lord, keepers of the entrance. Now, as I mentioned as we started this chapter, that the focus of this chapter by the chronicler is on the here and now of the chronicler's day, those who are living in the city of Jerusalem. But he does tie the function of these Levites back historically. This is not new responsibilities that these Levites have. This is a historical responsibility that's been carried down from generation to generation. Now there was a pause as they were exiled, but now it's being restored. So verse 20, interestingly, is going to go all the way back to what I would say is one of the heroes in the nation of Israel, Phinehas. So verse 20 says, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was ruler over them previously, and the Lord was with him. So the chronicler is tying the function of his day, of these gatekeepers, back historically to the early history of Israel. As Phinehas is the son of Eleazar, who is the son of Aaron. Now, you can go back and read a little bit more about Phinehas in Numbers chapter 25 and why I call him a hero in the nation of Israel. Because in Numbers chapter 25, we see the Israelites playing the harlot with the daughters of Moab. In other words, they are engaged in some pretty serious idolatry. And you can get the whole context. I would highly suggest you go back and pick up the whole context here. But I just want to look at verse 7 and 8. Because this is where Phinehas comes into the picture here. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, again, this historically would be during the wilderness wanderings, saw it is referring to the idolatry of the Israelites with the Moabites. He arose from the midst of the congregation and took a spear in his hand. Now, he doesn't arise and call the congregation together and sit down, let's just have a talk about this. This man is serious about the holiness of righteousness of God. Now, I'm not saying that we emulate his response here, because we are not. We have no authority to do what he did. And look at verse 8. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and pierced both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman, through the body. So the plague on the sons of Israel was checked. Again, different dispensation, very different historical context than we live today. But this man was a hero in Israel because he saw idolatry and he took care of it. So the chronicler is tying Shallum and his service as a gatekeeper back to Phinehas. And note at the last part of verse 20, and the Lord was with him. The Lord was with Phinehas because he was a godly man dedicated to the holiness and righteousness of God. And these gatekeepers should be the same way. Now, who's another famous gatekeeper? Can anybody think of off the top of your head? David? Not that I know of, possibly.
Zechariah.
What Zechariah?
Huh?
What Zechariah? Okay, in 1 Chronicles 9. No, actually, it's 1 Samuel 3:15. So Samuel lay down until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. But Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. And this goes back to where the Lord was speaking to Samuel as a young man. Okay, but this historical note that Samuel opened the doors. So it's possible that Samuel was a gatekeeper. Now we're going to come back to Samuel in just a minute. So that was just a little quick pop quiz. Interesting note. And then verse 21, as it's already been hinted here. Zechariah, the son of Meshilemiah, was gatekeeper of the entrance of the tent of meeting. All these who were chosen to be gatekeepers at the thresholds were 212. These were enrolled by genealogy in their villages, whom David and Samuel the seer appointed in their office of trust. So once again, the chronicler is tying this historical function in his day to post-exile Israel back historically, in this case to David and to Samuel. So they and their sons had charge of the gates of the house of the Lord, even the house of the tent as guards. The gatekeepers were on four sides, to the east, west, north, and south. Again, that's why I believe that there was four leaders of the gatekeepers, with one being the head gatekeeper. Verse 25, their relatives and villages were to come in every 7 days from time to time to be with them. So again, this is where the villages play a very important role. These Levites would live in the villages close to Jerusalem, and they would rotate every 7 days. They'd come in, do their temple service, and go back out. But this chapter specifically ties to the function of being gatekeepers. So verse 26 gives us the reason as why these relatives come in. For the four chief gatekeepers who were Levites were in an office of trust and were over the chambers and over the treasuries in the house of God. So these four major gatekeepers, they also had many other responsibilities. So they had to delegate. They couldn't do everything. So they delegated a lot to these Levites who would come in to help them. Verse 27, they spent the night around the house of God because the watch was committed to them, and they were in charge of opening it morning by morning. Now this also introduces us, this idea of watching over the gates of the temple introduces us to the idea that there's more than just having to open and close the gates. There's other responsibilities for the tribe of Levi. So in verse 28, we start seeing some of those responsibilities. Now, some of them had charge of the utensils of service, for they counted them when they brought them in and when they took them out. Some of them were also appointed over the furniture and over all the utensils of the sanctuary, and over the fine flour, and the wine, and the oil, and the frankincense, and the spices. Some of the sons of the priests, now we switch gears a little bit, we get more specific, the priests, prepared the mixing of the spices. Mattaniah, one of the Levites, who was the firstborn of Shallum, the Korite, had the responsibility over the things which were baked in pans. Some of the relatives of the sons of the Kohathites were over the showbread to prepare it every Sabbath. Now these are the singers, heads of the fathers' households of the Levites, who lived in the chambers of the temple, free from other service, for they were engaged in their work day and night. So in addition to having to open and close the gate each morning and each night, they had responsibilities over the utilities for service. So recall back to the sacrificial system. There was a lot going on that God built into the Levitical system with all the sacrifices, not only of animals, but we had the oil sacrifices with liquid sacrifices, grain sacrifices. There was a lot of details to this religious service. The pans, utensils, it just a lot going on. So they had to have other Levites come to serve the Lord in Jerusalem. So they were over the furniture, over the utensils, the fine flour, the wine, the oil, the frankincense. The priests prepared the mixing of the spices. We had responsibility over the baked things in pans. We had responsibility over the showbread. So all this stuff was delegated to the Levites by the four chief gatekeepers. And one of the other very important responsibility of the Levites was singing, as we've seen before, back in Leviticus chapter 6. Not Leviticus chapter 6, 1 Chronicles chapter 6, that detailed the genealogy of the Levites. They played a major role in the worship of Israel. So we have that note there in verse 33. And then we come to verse 34, which basically serves as a conclusion to this section. From verse 3 to 34, the focus on the repopulation of Jerusalem. And it says, these were the heads of the fathers' households of the Levites, according to their generations, chief men who lived in Jerusalem. And notice, when you compare verse 3 to verse 34, you have that phrase, lived in Jerusalem. So it's as if verse 3 and 34 are providing bookends to this section. So we start with verse 3, we end with verse 34. And that brings us to the last section here in chapter 9, going back to the genealogy of Saul. Now, most of this we've seen in chapter 8. So we're not going to go too much into detail with it, but we are going to read through it and then make a comment as to why do we see it again. So verse 35. In Gibeon, Jeiel, the father of Gibeon, lived, and his wife's name was Maacah. And his firstborn son was Abdon, then Zur, Kish, Baal, Ner, Nadab, Gedor, Ahio, Zechariah, and Miklot. Miklot became the father of Shimeam, and they also lived with their relatives in Jerusalem opposite their other relatives. Now, even though I said this is a genealogy of Saul, we also see that Jerusalem is tied to it as well. Verse 39, Ner became the father of Kish, and Kish became the father of Saul. And that would be the major focus on this genealogy of Saul. And Saul became the father of Jonathan, and Melchishua, and Abinadab, and Ishbaal, which later on possibly is Ishbosheth. Verse 40, the son of Jonathan. Now there's a focus on Jonathan here because he does play an important role in Israel's early history, especially with David. The son of Jonathan was Meribaal. Now this could be Mephibosheth. And Merib-Baal became the father of Micah. The sons of Micah were Pithon, Melech, Tariah, and Ahaz. Ahaz became the father of Jarah, and Jarah became the father of Elimet, Azmavet, and Zimri. And Zimri became the father of Moza, and Moza became the father of Beniah, and Rephaiah his son, Eliasah his son, Azel his son. Azel had 6 sons, whose names are these: Azrikam, Bokeru, and Ishmael, and Sheariah, and Obadiah, and Hanan. These were the sons of Azel. And that takes us through the genealogy of Saul. Now, why is this genealogy here when we've already covered it? Well, next week starts chapter 10. And 10 is really going to shift us away from the genealogies. We finally will get into the historical account from a Judean perspective, from the tribe of Judah, from a Davidic perspective. And Dr. Bubba will take us into chapter 10. But let's just read the first 2 verses so we can connect it to the end in chapter 9. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closely pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abidan, and Maacah, Shua, the sons of Saul. And it goes on to chronicle what happens to Saul. So we have a connection there between chapter 9 and chapter 10. So that genealogy there is to introduce us to chapter 10, which is going to be the downfall of Saul. There's not going to be much historical record of Saul. This is going to focus on his end. And then starting in chapter 11, we move right in to the reign of David. And there's going to be a lot of chapters focused on David. So that's a preview as to where we're going after finishing up the genealogies. But what do we learn as we walk away from chapter 9? I've just read a bunch of historical names like we have been over the last 11 or 12 weeks. And it's a similar thing we've learned from other genealogies. But once again, God's restoration of Israel after exile, and that's what we see here in chapter 9. God has carried them away to Babylon, but he's bringing them back, specifically to the holy city. So his restoration of Israel after exile, and notice I use the word Israel, not Judah and Israel, but Israel, to emphasize the unity of the nation. It's a preview of his future plans for Israel. He is not done with Israel. And though they failed, he still has a plan for them. And that plan we see here post-exile. He brings them back. Now, we bring it to today. He's still not done with Israel. He still has a plan to bless them, to bring them fully into the land, to have a Davidic king ruling over them. That hasn't happened yet. The king came, they rejected him, so he postponed that part of the plan. Now, some today will say that God has transferred everything, all these promises and blessings to Israel, to the church, because Israel acted unfaithfully. Well, let's go prior to the exile. What did we read in 1 Chronicles 9:1? Specifically the second part. And Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness. Judah was unfaithful to the Mosaic covenant. They were unfaithful to the Lord, and God disciplined them. He sent them to exile. He did the same thing to the northern kingdom, to the 10 tribes, going back to 1 Chronicles 5:25. But they acted treacherously against God of their fathers and played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land whom God had destroyed before them. And if you continue on, you can go back and look at that. It says that God raised up the king of Assyria and brought the northern kingdom into exile as well. In both cases, Israel and Judah were unfaithful to God, and he disciplined them. But what do we see in chapter 9? He's restoring them. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that yes, Israel was unfaithful to God, but it doesn't mean that he's transferring the promises to the church. We see the clear historical example that they were unfaithful, but he still has plans and purposes for them. There's no taking the promises and giving it to someone else. I mean, that's just absurd beyond our discussion here. But I think 1 Chronicles 9 shows us that despite unfaithfulness, God is still blessing Israel. He's still restoring them. He still has a plan and purposes. So you can't come to the New Testament and say, oh, well, they're unfaithful, so God takes away all this from Israel and gives it to the church. No, look back to 1 Chronicles. They were unfaithful. God judges, but God restores. And that's the same template that we have moving forward. When Christ returns to establish the millennial kingdom, Israel will be the focus of his plan. He will bring them into the land to begin the kingdom. And at that point, we see the great covenants made with Israel fulfilled, and fulfilled with Israel, not the church. So as much as God loves the church, Christ died for the church, and the church is a major, major part of God's program, we still have to separate Israel and the church. Two peoples of God. He blesses Israel, he blesses the church. But he does have two plans in place. And that's also a reminder that when we fail, God just doesn't kick us to the curb. We think of that individually. We can think of that in regards to the church. How many times has the church failed? Go back in church history. You'll study church history, and you'll read about the greatness of the church and how faithful the church was over the years. They did everything right. Right? Isn't that what you get when you read church history? No, the church, like Israel, has failed numerous times, and it continues to fail today. So if God takes away the promises of Israel because they're unfaithful, what's he going to do with the church? It's a dangerous theology to start thinking God replaces things in his plan. So we walk away, we cover the genealogies, we look at this great historical record. It reminds us of the faithfulness of God. The faithfulness of God in our individual lives, but also the faithfulness of God and his plans for human history. So thoughts, concerns, questions? Dan?
Oh, I just thought it was kind of interesting, with the bread, these priests were making the bread, the showbread and all that.
The Levites were in charge of the showbread, but the priests were in charge of the mixing of the spices.
Anyway, so it was interesting that David, went in, and he's a man after God's own heart, and he was just hungry.
Yeah, and it seemed to, there's more going on there that God does provide in a situation like that. But David also is prototypical to what we eventually see. We've talked about the two great lines of 1 Chronicles, the line of Judah and the line of Levi. The kingship, the throne, the monarchy, and the religious system. Now, we know Jesus comes along and he's going to sit on the throne of David. He's not there yet. He will sit on the throne of David. But he's also the great priest, too. Not in the Levitical sense, because he's not of the tribe of Levi. And his sacrifice, he's in the line of Melchizedek. But it's still the sacrificial nature. So he's the great king priest. Again, that same theme that we've seen here in Chronicles. But David, in a way, too, was a early kind of king priest in a way. Not of the tribe of Levi, tribe of Judah. So there's definitely some parallels there. Good thought. Anything else?
Comment made about Phineas. He must have been quite old. Was this?
Oh, he's the grandson of Aaron.
But I mean, if he was in the desert wandering around with Moses now, and then 70 years after the exile.
Well, I have to rethink the exact timing of the incident. But he wasn't a young lad either. Yeah. As far as how old he was, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and think through that a little bit. Probably not an older guy either. Probably a younger guy, but not a child. So
Because you said this was written when they all came back. After
First
70
Chronicles.
years of Babylon.
Yes. No. Okay, I see what you're saying. No, Phineas goes back to the wilderness wanderings.
Right.
Yes. The writing of
So
Chronicles,
was he a gatekeeper then? Was Phineas also a gatekeeper?
he seems to be, but at that point it would have been the tabernacle, because remember they would have carried the tabernacle with them.
And so did the temple have gates and then they had the outer tent around it?
The temple?
I mean, the sanctuary.
Yeah, I mean there was gates. There was gates both, I believe, of the temple and the city. Because obviously the city plays a big role
Well,
too.
no, not the city
but-
of Jerusalem, but in the wandering in the desert.
Well, you had entrances.
Yeah.
Yes, you had entrances. I don't know if you consider those necessarily gates, but you also had the idea of surrounding the tabernacle, and I think that's where the Levites would have played a major role. Because yeah, it would have been much more isolated versus having the grand temple, Solomon's temple.
So was Phineas a gatekeeper at the temple?
It seems at the temple,
mean-
no, he would have died by the time the temple is built in Solomon's day.
Oh,
Might be easier to understand is doorkeeper instead of gatekeeper.
Gatekeeper. Yeah, we think of gate. Yeah, and I think it was, and I had to relook at the Hebrew, but I think maybe I shouldn't say this because I haven't looked. I need to relook at it. But the idea is the opening. You know, he's the keeper of the opening. So we translate gatekeeper, but no, that's a good question. Yeah, because the chronicler's interweaving these two ideas. He's focused on post-exile, but he's also tying post-exile back into historical Israel. So yeah, you got to have to kind of keep it together.
Gotta keep it
So-
back and lines together between the two.
Exactly, because he mentions people who were alive post-exile, but then he ties some of them. He goes back into their genealogy. So some of those guys that we've talked about were not living at the time of post-exile. Some of them were, but the others he's tying back historically.
Phineas was not. Okay.
Yeah, and even the mention of David and Samuel and Asaph and others. So, yeah, he's really interweaving the two ideas together to prove a point that God is working in present post-exile, but that is also historically connected. You can't divorce present time from history, and we see that I think very emphatic here in chapter 9.
Once again, reinforcing to the group who's come back from Babylon, that the Mosaic covenant and the law, and all the sacrifice, everything are still in force.
Right.
And we thought, get it in order.
Yeah. And again, and Dr. Bubble mentioned several weeks ago, about the importance of coming back into Jerusalem, especially for the Levites and priests. They had to prove their genealogy. And we see that, I believe, in Nehemiah, either Ezra or Nehemiah, where they're very serious. If you cannot prove your genealogy, you cannot be here, or you can't serve here at least. So that's a very important. Yeah, it's post-exile, and I think hopefully we've emphasized it enough where we see the importance that of the historical context. This is not pre-exile. This is post-exile. They've been through two major exiles. They've been resettled, so now it's time to get back in operation. Now, I mentioned the throne. Obviously, at this time, there is no king of Israel, but that idea of monarchy, of the throne of David, is vastly important.
Just one more. With the casting of the lots, was that because so many people wanted to live in Jerusalem that they could only let 1 out of 10?
I read it, and again, I have to go back and look at it a little further, and I don't know if we're told. I have the idea that people didn't want to live in Jerusalem.
That's because I.
Yes.
when I read it
Is
before,
that what the impression you
I think
get?
They wanted to live in their.
Yeah, they want to go back and live in their places.
That's what I was thinking
Yes.
too.
Mhm.
That they didn't want to live there, but they needed people to live there. So 1 in 10, but you
Yeah.
gotta go.
Especially with the note
But it turns
there.
out probably to be a blessing in a sense. I mean,
Yeah, and that's why I think the note there, the verse 2, and the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem.
You gotta figure, these people were farmers.
Mhm.
And they weren't tradesmen sitting in a city. They're gonna have to move there and count on becoming something new.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and personal property was a very, very important aspect of Mosaic law.
yes.
I mean, think about all the laws that dealt with your possessions, especially tribal land or family land. It was vastly important to the nation of Israel. Vastly important. So if you're coming back and your property, your family property that goes back generation to generation, generation to generation to generation, you'd want to go back to that, not to Jerusalem. So that idea was very important in their mind. So I think that probably played a major role of it too. Like, I want to go back to my granddaddy, granddaddy's granddaddy, granddaddy's 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 land. As great as Jerusalem is, now again we can start speculating a lot. That I think you can prove. You can start speculating a lot, but if a foreign power is going to come back in, where's it coming? Jerusalem. So maybe there's some fear there too. That's just my guess. It's like, we've already been through all this exile, or we've read about it, and we don't want to go through this again. I mean, if we're going to come all the way back, again, think about the exiles. They had it pretty good in Babylon. They're leaving that to come back to repopulate a land that's been decimated. The northern kingdom's been filled with a bunch of Samaritans, or what would become Samaritans. Not Samaritans, but the mixed people in the northern. Yeah, Samaritans. Yeah, I'm right. Okay. Sorry, I had a brain dump right there.
They don't want to leave Jerusalem.
Yeah, so they come back to repopulate this land. It's very easily, again, in human perspective, if they're not thinking divine thoughts, the human part of us is saying, I don't want to be in a place where, the next major power is going to come through and wipe us out again. Again, that's if you take your mind off the Lord. Again, that's total speculation, though. So,
Just real quick related to the piece that you were mentioning about First Chronicles 9 being Apex forgot not being finished with Israel.
Mhm.
God doesn't throw with Israel away like that's just because of disobedience. But similar, Paul obviously in chapters 9 and 11 Romans makes the argument in great detail that if Israel's rejection of God was to his glory, how much more will their acceptance?
yeah, and those are the 3 chapters I would go to really drive that point home. Israel past, present, and future, 9, 10, 11. And then I would go to something like here in Chronicles, and to me this is just evidence of that doctrinal truth that Paul points out, so that's good. Okay. Well, we talk a lot about the tribe of Judah, and obviously out of the tribe of Judah comes the Messiah. So now we switch our focus over. Can you stop recording?